Hello everybody. It is the 1st of May 2012 and we are in Limache, Chile. I'm sitting with Howard Richards. He's a philosopher of social science. And we have been making videos together now about several topics, and we have already received feedback. And for example, one feedback letter from Magnus Haavelsrud. He writes, "Thank you, Howard and Evelin, for this. Make more." So here we are making more videos. How about corporate responsibility as a topic and the new and reformed capitalism you are mentioning? Good business, in other words, and implications for departments of economy and for research in economy and their great need for transdisciplinarity, also in economic thought. So, this is the task you have.
Okay, I think this is an opportunity to talk about what a mutual friend of me and Magnus, Luke, calls my have your cake and eat it too socialism. So this is sort of socialism with capitalism preserved in terms of its desirable aspects. So let me say a couple of things about what I think the problem is not, and then what I think the problem is, and then why I think a solution, what I sort of see as elements of the solution. I think, for one thing, the problem is not a class struggle in which the rich keep the poor down because it's to the interest of the rich to keep the poor down. I think that's not the problem. And the reason it's not the problem is that it's not really to the interest of the rich to keep the poor down. It's true that some rich people are generous and they want to bring up the poor because they're human beings and so on. But it's simply objectively, as you sometimes said, the rich people at this point in history are like people with a first-class cabin on a sinking ship. If the ship goes down, they go down too. They go down with social disaster, ecological, and so on and so forth. So it is really to the interest of the rich today to abolish poverty. Right. And many rich people know that, yeah. And their official institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are all working on abolishing poverty. Right. That's official public policy in almost every country in the world. So it's not that there's not a policy to abolish poverty, it's that the paradigm that we're locked into doesn't work. So it's not that, so I think the class struggle is not the problem, because even though there are rich people who do put the poor down because they think it's to their interest, they're mistaken. Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's not. So the rich, if the rich were educated and realized their true interests, yeah. They would realize that a good livelihood for everybody is to their interest. So that's not the problem. The problem is also not the existence of private businesses. I mean, it's not as though the world will never be a good world until there's not a single private business left that's where somebody is in business for profit and hiring people. Now, what is the problem? The problem is the necessity for a regime of accumulation. We have become so dependent on the profit-making mode that everything else has to be sacrificed to it. The problem is that we cannot make rational and ethical decisions about the proper mix of different elements of the economy. You know, I think most sensible people have believed for a long time that a reasonable economy has a private sector, a public sector, a non-profit sector, a cooperative sector. It has neighborhood institutions that work. It has families that work, or some people think the family's outmoded, but if not a family, communities that work. Mm-hmm. Family type, sorts of thing. So it has communities that work. I think most sensible people think there's not just one institution, like the private profit-making big corporation, that is the definition of a good society. It's not, you know, I don't think anybody thinks that anymore that there could be a centrally planned economy that would centrally plan everything, work out. In fact, I don't think any socialist ever thought that. Right. I think it was Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek, the anti-socialists, who thought that socialists are supposed to think this, and what they are supposed to think is implausible. But I think almost all socialists have always thought that there had to be some greater variety. Even Soviet planning was not that all-pervasive as it theoretically is supposed to be, according to anti-socialists. So my definition of when you get to socialism is pretty much the same as John Dewey and Karl Popper, in the sense that you get to socialism when you have what Popper calls an open society, or what Dewey calls an experimental society, where you can design institutions that work, right? And if they don't work, you discard them and modify them, and you keep evaluating them.
You mentioned the definition of learning.
Definition of learning of Chris Argyris, a great sort of management thinker. Learning is detecting mistakes and correcting them. So in the open society, or the experimental society, Dewey says every institution should be an experiment. We try it out, we evaluate it, we study it. In Popper's book, the social sciences are a key part of the open society, because the social sciences provide feedback on how things are working. And they find we systematically make them work better. Right? Well, that's what we don't have. We don't have an open society, and we don't have an experimental society. And the reason we don't have it is that it doesn't matter what social scientists find would be good institutions. The institutions that we must have are the ones that facilitate capital accumulation, that attract investors and avoid capital flight. So we have an overriding systemic imperative that makes it impossible to be rational. So when we
have an experiment, but it's somehow watertight and we can't get out.
We can't get out of it. In the sort of famous phrase of Max Weber, it's an iron cage. Right? So when we get to the point where our multiple logics are sufficient that we can govern private for-profit business and only accept it when it actually serves socially valid purposes, and not allow it to do just whatever because we need jobs at any price, then we will, and this is a Karl Marx definition, then Karl Marx says, then the pre-history of human beings will be over and the history of human beings will begin. We haven't really begun history, Marx says, because we haven't been able to design our institutions as human beings sort of choosing what is the best way to administer our lives. We've been busy with people dominating other people, and we haven't got to the point where we can work together to make rational, sensible solutions. So that is the problem. Now, when you get to solving the problem, and this is where I think Magnus is curious about what I think, capitalism has a role to play. Capitalism, defined as Marx defined it. I mean, Marx defined capitalism as producing commodities for profit. In fact, that's the definition of a commodity. A commodity is something where you produce things for profit. It's the purpose of producing a commodity is to sell it. So that has a role to play as a part of the economy. And as Schumpeter and others make forcibly clear, this very sort of crazy, destructive type of capitalism that historically has existed, in spite of all of the evil it has done, has also enormously increased productivity. You know, Marx and Engels say that in the Communist Manifesto. There's been another remark by Marx was that capitalism is both the best thing and the worst thing that ever happened to humanity. And so we can't do without that creative dynamism. We can't support the size population we have without that. On the other hand, we can't live with it either as it is now, because it runs our lives. We need to run it, right, instead of it running us. Now, I'm assuming a couple of things here. One is the Managerial Revolution. I'm assuming that most major productive enterprises today that produce most of the goods you find on the shelves in supermarkets that are produced at pretty good quality at pretty low prices, most of that stuff is produced by institutions that are professionally managed. There's a separation of ownership and management. And so there's a professional managers are perfectly capable of being socially responsible. There's Milton Friedman is famous for saying that the only social responsibility of business is to maximize profits. I have yet to find a CEO who agrees with that. There may be one somewhere, but I found it almost universal that professionally managed corporations have a mission statement and have a vision statement with a number of objectives, and maximizing profit is not their only goal. It may be in some simplified version of Marxist theory or some neoliberal theory like Friedman's. That should be their goal, according to some.
What about the legal side, that CEOs may be sued if they, by shareholders if they?
That's a problem. That's a problem. CEOs are sometimes not allowed to be as socially conscious as they would like to be. And no, let me say too, here this is a point Peter Drucker makes, that if you ask the question, how can we stay in business? And you answer it by maximizing profit, your answer is wrong.
Right.
Right. The things that will allow a company to prosper and continue are various, and they include consumer confidence. Drucker cites a study of the Bell telephone system once, who sort of asked themselves the question, what does Bell telephone have to do to continue for indefinitely in time? And the answer was, we have to convince our customers they're getting good service from us. Right? The answer was not, we have to maximize our profits. Right? And that's generally, he claims, I think he's right, it's empirically true that a business that focuses on profits, especially short-term profits, is not going to last as long, and the people in it are not going to be as happy as one that has more legitimate social goals. So one of his points is that a private business, profit-making business, produces some good or service. So it is already socially responsible because it's already doing something. If you're manufacturing yogurt, you're making oatmeal, you're making patent medicines, you're making bicycles. This is already social responsibility because people are getting a good quality product at a reasonable price by an efficient business. And then Drucker goes on, well, profit is something you need to have in order to carry out your objective. The objective is to provide some good and service. The profit is a necessary means to that end. So I think the managerial revolution is a sort of a key element in have your cake and eat it too socialism. That the management of the public sector, of the nonprofit sector, and the private sector are in many ways similar. People go to the same graduate schools and study the same methods for studying, and then they end up administering in different sectors of the economy. So there's important similarities there. And another point is, I do not think you will ever persuade the majority of voters in any country to vote to abolish private business. That's just not anything people will vote for, right? So if you're going to arrive at socialism nonviolently and democratically, it has got to be a socialism that includes capitalism in the sense of working things for, in the sense of producing things for profit. But I just was talking about the managerial revolution. Notice that what the managerial revolution does is it separates management, which is achieving objectives, and you can't achieve objectives efficiently until you have objectives. And almost all companies have a list of objectives in their mission. They do a mission review that includes a number of things that not only make the CEO feel good because he's doing something socially constructive, it makes the employees feel good. C.K. Prahalad said that one of the ways of being a good leader is to give your people a cause worth working for. So if you want to be a good leader of Mercedes-Benz Corporation, and you can say, the cause that we're working for is we're developing the green technology of the future at Mercedes-Benz. That means your engineers, your accountants, your salespeople, they're going to be happier with their job. They're going to be more committed to the business because they believe in the business because it's worth believing in. Right? So that's on the sort of managerial side. But there's a whole other question, that is what happens to the profits? One of the things that the business has to do, it has to have, if it's in the private sector, it has to have a positive bottom line. It can't go on all the time running losses. Or it can always dissolve, which is perfectly legitimate. You can always dissolve a business when it's no longer useful and you can start some other business. But as long as it's going, it has to have a positive bottom line. And so one of the logical ways that managers make decisions is they try to do things efficiently so that they will achieve their objectives and make money. And if they don't make money, then they know they must have done something wrong somewhere in their managerial tasks. But once they've done that, what do they do with the money? Well, they ship it out to the owners, and they don't even know what happens to the money. I own stock in some companies. I'm sure that the people who are managing the companies where I own stock don't know that I'm using some of my money to support the neighborhood council's support for the unemployed here in Limache, Chile. They have no idea what happens to the profits. Right? And it doesn't matter. They can manage their corporations perfectly well, whoever the stockholders are, and whatever the stockholders do with the money. So if the stockholders are churches, if they're medical research foundations, such as the stockholder of Merck Pharmaceuticals is a medical research foundation, if they're the government has a 40% share in many businesses, especially in Latin America. So the moral question, what to do with what Marx called surplus value, or with profits, is always a moral question someone has to decide, and there's no reason whatever why it has to go to support a leisure class who does nothing but sail around the Mediterranean trying to find the ideal lover. There is the euthanasia of the rentier class that Keynes talked about is perfectly feasible in a managerial society where capital to run businesses is raised on capital markets, and the capital markets can have very many kinds of ownership. Of course, the biggest single block of stockholders are the pension funds. So, and that's increasingly so in many countries. So the pension funds as major stockholders go perfectly well with enlightened capitalism, and enlightened capitalism is a functional part of enlightened socialism. If what you mean by socialism is the people have the power to design the institutions that work to serve their interests. See what I'm saying? Okay.
And would Pierre Calame play here?
I really recommend the work of Pierre Calame, but I don't really feel authorized to express it very well. I hope that someday you'll be able to interview Pierre. He's the head of a group called Initiative pour repenser l'économie, which in the French-speaking world is working on rethinking economics. And one of his main points, and he is also a person with great practical experience. He worked for Shell Oil for a while in the private sector, and he worked for the government of France under Mitterrand in the public works area. So he has a lot of practical experience in administration in both the private and public sector. And a number of things he calls for make a whole lot of sense. One is to think of economics as a form of governance. And what kind of governance you need depends on what you're governing. So the sort of governance appropriate for a tropical rainforest is really not the same sort of governance as you would want for running a dairy. Right. So if you're producing milk and you can produce more milk and sell it to more customers, that's one thing. If you're producing coal and the coal is going to run out sometime because there's only so much in the ground, that's a whole different governance problem. If you have natural species that have to be preserved for the preservation of the biosphere, that's another whole different problem. So the idea that economics is just one science that applies to everything is mistaken. There have got to be different modes of governance for different types of goods that human beings are concerned with. And he's very practical about this, and he has ideas on how to do it, and I recommend his writings. I believe that his main book, the Essay on Economy, has been translated into English recently. And I just downloaded his work on active subsidiarity from the web. Yes, yes, he has a very strong idea about how local governments should be not just sort of having policies and programs and projects and evaluating how they work, but should be facilitators and cooperators with civil society. That at the grassroots there should be an active civil society with the public and private sector should be working together at the local level, and what the public sector should be doing is trying to maximize the potential of change in the civil society. He agrees with me that it's really the structure of civil society that needs to change, and that the public sector should be working with civil society, helping to bring out its its best features.
So we can ask him and to make a video like that in Paris now.
Yes, next time you go to Paris, you must interview Pierre
And
Calam.
he can do it even without us.
Maybe so. Maybe,
yes, that would be lovely.
Maybe so.
We can somehow motivate him, perhaps. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, we can find someone in Paris to interview him. I think that would be excellent. He speaks English.
Would be wonderful. So, but thank you so much. What else do you think you should add?
Well, one of Magnus's questions was about sort of academic economics. I think academic economics should be in the sociology department. Emil Durkheim thought so too. That I think academic economics should be incorporated into the social sciences. This is what Amartya Sen thinks. He says Amartya Sen advocates socioeconomics. You know, think of economics as a kind of sociology where you're talking about human relationships, about making institutions that work. Right. And to get away from the mathematical models that are supposed to be somehow hard science because they look like physics or something of that sort. That would be one of many academic. But I'm preaching to the converted, because there are many people who are now teaching in economics departments who already think that and who are just waiting for the university to be reorganized so that they can do the sort of thing that they see needs to be done.
And you also point out that normally it was Schumpeter who you pointed me at, who says that there might be philosophical thoughts that economists have, but when you look at what they actually do in their analysis, they don't draw on their own philosophical thoughts.
Yes, that often happens. That often the technical analysis will amount to looking over government statistics and trying to find some pattern in the numbers, because you have to publish something, and that's the easiest way to publish something.
Right. So thank you very much.
An excellent article on this, by the way, is by Robert Boyer of University of Grenoble about the relationship between economics and history, where he gives the example of Russia, where the Harvard economists went over with IMF, and they sort of believed that if the Soviet Union were just dismantled, then capitalism would appear. But they didn't realize the sociological, historical dimension of the problem, that capitalism appeared in England and France as a part of a long social history that created those institutions. But since economists are so used to thinking mathematically and thinking that it's just the natural world that they're writing about, they thought you just had to remove Soviet central planning and then the natural world would emerge and it would be Russian capitalism. Well, of course, we all know it didn't work that way. Russia turned out to be much different from the expectations that it would turn into a sort of model form of capitalism if you just removed central planning. And this, Mboye sort of shows how that's rooted in the sort of normal procedure of academic economics to look for invariant relationships among variables. That the world just isn't made that way. The social world is just not made of variables that have some calculable, constant relationship one to another that persists over time. You hear them talking, they say, well, this happened because the supply curve shifted to the left. Well, as if the supply curve that they draw was a causal factor in the real world. Or they will say, well, the elasticity of this was that. But elasticity, is a concept describing data, and there's no reason to suppose that out in the real world there's going to be a constant entity called elasticity, which has a causal effect, so that when one thing happens, something else will happen. I think managers tend to know that, and I think that's why management schools have generally, nowadays, are separate from economics departments. It used to be that what management was essentially a subdivision of economics, but nowadays it's not. And I think that's because there's a general understanding that the world doesn't really work the way that academic economics says it does. And if you want to be effective in the world, you have to study something else.
Wow. Thank you. Much food for thought. Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.